All right, so in this video, we are going to start looking at plotting libraries in Python. So this is going to be the first in a series of videos. And in particular, we are going to focus on matplotlib and Seaborn, which are two of the, I would think arguably the most common plotting utilities used for Python. So I've got just a blank JupyterLab instance started here, and I'm just going to launch a Jupyter notebook in a folder. And what we're going to do today is just get a little bit of our bearings about matplotlib in particular and how we work with figures and subplots in matplotlib. And this is often something that I think people tend to struggle with. Again, I think a lot of times when people are working with plotting, they might, go on the internet, look up things on Stack Overflow, and instead of really trying to, understand exactly what's going on, they might just kind of copy and paste some code snippets. And I will say that, matplotlib in particular, and this is not just true of matplotlib, I've seen this in other languages like you've got ggplot and R. A lot of times if you're just looking at the code for a plotting utility, it's not necessarily as readable or intuitive exactly what's going on. And personally, I think a lot of people just don't take the time to kind of understand at kind of a basic level what's going on underneath the hood, or how these things are interacting with one another, and it leads to some confusion, right? So people tend to have maybe a negative perception of working with these libraries because they don't understand things and have never really taken the time to do that. So hopefully, I'm going to maybe peel back the cover a little bit, let you kind of hopefully get a fairly basic understanding of what's going on with matplotlib in this video and a couple of others that will follow. Then we'll move over to Seaborn. But hopefully this will be quite helpful for you in thinking about how to write code to do plotting, because once you kind of understand the basics of what's going on in the library, it's actually quite powerful, and you can make some very nice visualizations. All right, so enough talking. Let me do the import. So we're going to import two things, and let me hide this on the side here. So we are going to import matplotlib.pyplot, so the pyplot module from matplotlib, and the typical convention is that we will import that as plt, and then we're also going to import numpy. So especially when we get over to start working with Seaborn, we're going to move over to working with pandas data frames, because Seaborn works very nicely with pandas data frames and actually Polar's data frames as well. But just to kind of get our bearings about matplotlib, we're going to start with just generating some data using NumPy. And I keep talking about Seaborn. So the way to kind of think about this whole ecosystem is matplotlib is kind of giving us the basic plotting framework, right? It allows us to create figures where we might have multiple subplots in a figure. And Seaborn is more or less a tool for doing statistical type of visualizations. So what we'll typically do is we'll set up a matplotlib figure, and then we'll use Seaborn to maybe create certain subplots within that figure. So the reason that I'm kind of talking about them almost, interchangeably, it seems like here, is I tend to use them very closely together. It's not that we're going to use Seaborn or matplotlib. We're going to use them together. All right. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and import NumPy, matplotlib as PLT, NumPy as MP. And let's just go ahead and let's generate some very, very straightforward data. So I'm just going to generate a sequence of X values. So I'm going to say it's going to be, value or val for val in range. We'll go -20 to 21. So I'm just going to be generating, in this case, X is going to have integer values from -20 all the way up to +20. And then we're just going to generate some Y values, basically just taking the square of each of those. So essentially you're going to generate a parabola. So I'm going to say xval, or what we're going to do in our Y, we're going to square each xval or xval in X. All right, so if I were to look at the first, let's say, 5 entries in X, so we go from -20 to -16, and then if we were to do the same thing for Y, all right, so Negative 20 squared is 400, then 361, 324, so forth. All right, so we're essentially just generating a parabola. All right, let me do a real quick restart clear just to get everything cleaned up. I've ran a few cells extra. All right, so we've got some x values, we've got some y values, and let's see how we can use matplotlib to just generate a very simple visualization showing the change in y as x varies. All right, so I'm going to have x varying along the horizontal axis, and then y is going to be varying along the vertical axis. All right, now again, if you go out kind of onto the internet, if you're looking up, well, how do I plot this? You're going to see a lot of different variations with matplotlib. There's a few different ways that you can use it. And again, I think that adds a little bit to, some confusion with people that are just especially getting started with Python, because it looks like, okay, well, when I put in this specific use case and ask that question to Google, here's the response I get. And when I change that, I get maybe something different. Or you might be looking at different examples for the same search query and you see different ways of doing it. And that kind of gets a little bit, confusing. So I'm going to show you, I'm going to really focus on, in these videos, just, really a handful of ways that I have learned to use this. And I do it consistently. I understand it, and I can, it offers me the flexibility that I need for pretty much all of my use cases. So I would encourage you to do the same. So again, you don't have to use exactly the method I show you, but this works for me. To me, it kind of allows me to really understand what's going on, whereas I can, go in and do all of the configuration necessary to get things the way that I like them. And what that is I'm going to use a subplots method from PLT to generate essentially a figure that can contain one or more subplots, right? So if we think about, just this broad notion of a figure, so think about a figure as, just kind of this object where you can place different visualizations within that object that are potentially related. So that figure can just have one subplot. So essentially that figure is just whatever that subplot is, or you can have multiple. You might have two subplots, essentially, laid out side by side, or you can have a grid of subplots, right? So maybe 2 rows, 2 columns of subplots. And so I like to use this PLT subplots because it allows me to kind of work within any of those different configurations. And this is how you define it. So plt.subplots, we're just going to use this basic way of defining it. So let's just run this as is. So here's going to be essentially the method that I'm going to use to create these subplots. When I run this, you can see that it returns to me essentially this region here. So it looks like we've got this figure region, and it actually says, hey, I'm returning a figure of size 640 by 480 with one axis. And then notice that there's a comma right here, and it returns an axis. So let's just kind of peer into this. So what is the type of this thing? All right, so it's actually returning to me a tuple. All right, so it's returning 2 things. That's one thing that you should know. So it's returning 2 things. One of those, the first thing is this figure item, and then the other thing is an axis. Okay, so it's returning a figure and an axis. So a lot of times what we will do, as you will notice, is that when we have something like a call to plt.subplots, we will start this with fig and then comma ax equals, right? Why are we doing 2? Well, it's returning a tuple of 2 things, right? So it's returning, the first thing is this figure object, which the way to think about that is that's going to give you access to customizations at the figure level. So remember, our figure can have multiple subplots. So this gives us some controls that we can use at the level of the figure, like maybe giving an overarching title that applies to all of the different subplots. And then it's going to return us these axes that we can use to put individual visualizations on. All right. Now, before I do that save, I do want to show you, and I know it's a little bit annoying because every time I run this, it moves me down to the bottom. But if I'm going to get inside this plt.subplots, I'm going to hold down Shift and hit Tab. And there's some arguments that we can provide. We'll talk a little bit more about this as we kind of go along. But notice that we can provide a number of rows and a number of columns. All right, so what if we want, by default, it's just 1 row, 1 column. So it's just giving you a single axis back. What if I said I want 2 columns? So I could say, well, incalls equals 2. All right, so notice that this region now, so this overall figure, right, now has 2 areas in this. So this left area here and the right area. And we can see when we look at that tuple, it's saying, well, hey, I'm returning a figure of size 640 by 480, and it has 2 axes. All right, so that's the first element, right? So if I'm going to grab 0, right, the first item of that tuple, right there, and actually grab that figure region instead of just printing that out, sorry. But that first element in that tuple is that figure. And then notice right here, so when we didn't have this in columns equals to 2, right, so if I just set that equal to 1, it just returns this axis. But when we do in columns equals 2, it's returning an array. That's going to be really important. I think this is where some confusion really comes in as people start working, particularly with subplots. Because if I've got in columns is equal to 1, right, if I just have one area that I'm going to plot on, it's just returning this axis object. And we can directly interact with that to visualize certain things. But then when I go to 2, it no longer returns an axis. It looks like it's returning a NumPy array with how many axes? 1 and 2. Okay, but we'll get to those levels of complexity. So right now, let's just go back to this basic version. So I'm just calling subplots, and it's returning 2 things. So I'm going to store the first in an argument or a variable called fig, and the second in a variable called ax. All right. All right, and with this ax object, so I'm just going to do ax right below, dot and hit tab. We have, as we do oftentimes, or as is often the case with a lot of these Python libraries, we have a lot of methods, we have a lot of attributes, we have some classes. There's a lot of things that we can do with that ax object that we've defined. We're going to look at the most basic today, which is just simply plot. All right. So if I do a dot plot and then I hit Shift Tab, you can see, hey, this will do a line plot. So it's plotting Y versus X as lines or markers. And there's a couple of different call signatures that you can use. The most basic is it expects the first argument to be a sequence that specifies your X values, and then the second to be your Y values. All right, so let's do that. I'm going to do a real quick restart clear. So we've got some X's and we've got some Y's. So I'm going to do an ax.plot, and I'm going to say X, Y. And then what we tend to call, whenever we want to display or output a figure to the screen, we'll call a plt.show. And then whatever figure, whatever axes you've been working with, that's going to be essentially a call to render those objects as a figure. All right, so there we go. So there is our parabola that we defined. So we had integers going from -20 all the way up to +20, and the Y values that we stored, those were just going to be the square values, or the square of each one of our X's. All right, so this is kind of the most simple variant of using this, right? So typically I'm going to work with subplots or a subplot mosaic, which will be shown in a later video. But typically working with subplots, and then I'm going to use the axes associated with my subplots. In this case, I've only got one axis, but I might have defined multiple rows and columns of subplots. In that case, I'm going to get back multiple axis objects, and we can kind of configure what we want to plot on each one. All right, so I'm going to stop this video right here, and then in the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to take this visualization and we're going to start doing just some basic modifications to it. So this one is just, very much the basics of, okay, we've got some data. How can we use just the easiest form of subplots, just providing it with no arguments, just the default, and then this dot plot method to come up with a line plot.